December 17th, 1944. A small farming village in Belgium called Wereth. 11 American soldiers are trying to survive the worst military disaster the US Army has faced in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge has just begun. German forces have broken through Allied lines. These 11 men are cut off, surrounded, lost in enemy territory. They're members of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, one of only 2 African-American artillery units in the European theater. They've been under artillery fire for 24 hours. Their position has been overrun. They've been separated from their unit. They're exhausted, freezing, and running low on ammunition. They make a decision: surrender to the first German unit they encounter. It's their only chance of survival. They will surrender, but they will not survive. What happens to these 11 men in the hours after their capture is one of the most brutal war crimes committed against American soldiers in World War II. Their fingers are cut off, their eyes are gouged out, their legs are broken. They are tortured for hours before being executed, and then, for 50 years, their story is buried, forgotten, erased from the history of the Battle of the Bulge. This is not a story about combat heroism. This is a story about what happened when racism and war crimes collided in a frozen Belgian field. This is a story about 11 men who died horribly and were forgotten deliberately. This is one of the most disturbing stories from World War II, and it's been hidden for decades. If you want to make sure these stories aren't forgotten, hit subscribe right now and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. These global stories need global witnesses. Let's make sure the Wereth 11s are remembered. This is the story of the Wereth 11 massacre, and it starts with understanding who these men were and what they were facing on December 17, 1944. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was activated in 1942 as one of the few black combat units in the US Army. Most black soldiers in World War II were relegated to service and supply roles. The 333rd was different. They were combat artillery, trained to provide fire support for infantry operations. They'd arrived in Europe in October 1944, assigned to support the 106th Infantry Division. By December, they were positioned in the Ardennes forest, along what was supposed to be a quiet sector of the front. The Germans had been retreating for months. Allied commanders believed the Ardennes was too difficult for a major German offensive. Too many forests, too few roads, terrain that favored defenders. They were catastrophically wrong. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, the largest German offensive of the war's final year. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by 1,400 tanks and assault guns, smashed into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was directly in the path of this assault. Specifically, Battery C of the 333rd was positioned near the town of Schönberg, Belgium, providing fire support. When the German attack began, Battery C was surrounded almost immediately. The 11 men who would become known as the Wereth 11 were part of Battery C's service section. Their names deserve to be spoken. Private First Class James A. Stewart, Detroit, Michigan. Staff Sergeant Thomas J. Fort, Mississippi. Corporal Mager Bradley, Mississippi. Private First Class George Davis Jr., Alabama. Private First Class Thomas J. Fort, New York. Private First Class Curtis Parnell, unknown hometown. Private First Class Robert L. Turner, Tennessee. Private First Class James L. Leatherwood, Mississippi. Private First Class Nathaniel Moss, Texas. Private First Class George W. Maddox, Georgia. Private First Class Dew W. Turner, unknown hometown. On December 16th and 17th, Battery C came under intense German artillery fire. The German offensive was overwhelming American positions all along the line. Units were being surrounded, cut off, destroyed. Communications broke down. Command and control collapsed. By the morning of December 17th, Battery C's position was untenable. German forces were closing in. The battery commander gave the order: destroy the artillery pieces to prevent capture, split into small groups, and try to reach American lines. The 11 men of service section made their way through snow-covered forests, trying to navigate back to friendly forces. They were lost. The landscape was unfamiliar. German forces were everywhere, and it was brutally cold. Temperatures had dropped below freezing, with heavy snow making movement exhausting. At some point on December 17th, the 11 men made a decision that would seal their fate. They approached the farmhouse of Matthias Langer in the village of Wereth, seeking shelter and possibly hoping to surrender safely to German forces through civilian intermediaries. Matthias Langer would later testify that the 11 soldiers arrived at his farm exhausted and desperate. They asked for food and water. Langer gave them what he could, but he also warned them German troops were everywhere. Staying was dangerous. The soldiers were too exhausted to keep moving. They decided to rest briefly at the farm. Within hours, a German patrol from the 1st SS Panzer Division arrived. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, were not regular German army troops. They were ideological soldiers, indoctrinated in Nazi racial theories, responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the war, and they had just found 11 black American soldiers. What happened next is difficult to describe, but it must be described, because forgetting is a second death. The 11 soldiers were taken prisoner by SS troops from Kampfgruppe Knittel, part of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. This unit had a reputation for brutality even among SS formations. They'd committed multiple atrocities on the Eastern Front. Now they were in Belgium, and they'd captured 11 black American soldiers. According to later testimony and forensic evidence, the soldiers were not immediately executed. They were held for hours, and during those hours, they were systematically tortured. The evidence discovered when American forces retook the area in January 1945 tells the story. Multiple soldiers had their fingers cut off, not cleanly, but hacked off with bayonets or knives. Some had been mutilated while still alive, as evidenced by blood loss patterns and defensive wounds. Several had their eyes gouged out. Again, forensic analysis determined this was done before death, not post-mortem. Legs were broken, not from falls or combat injuries, but from deliberate blows with rifle butts or clubs. Bayonet wounds covered their bodies, dozens per soldier in some cases. Forensic pathologists who examined the bodies concluded the bayonet wounds were inflicted in a frenzy, far beyond what would be needed to kill. The soldiers were shot, but only after the torture. The bullet wounds were the final act, not the cause of most injuries. Why? Why this level of brutality? The answer is racism combined with Nazi ideology. The SS had been indoctrinated with racial theories that ranked humans by race. Black people were considered Untermenschen, subhuman, in Nazi ideology. They were ranked even below Slavic peoples in the Nazi racial hierarchy. SS training materials explicitly dehumanized black people. German propaganda portrayed black soldiers as savage, primitive, incapable of civilization. The presence of black American troops in Europe was framed as an insult, as evidence of America's racial degeneracy and weakness. When SS soldiers encountered black American prisoners, they didn't see fellow soldiers deserving of Geneva Convention protections. They saw racial enemies, subhumans who could be treated as less than human. There's also a tactical element. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last desperate offensive. German commanders had ordered ruthless prosecution of the attack. Mercy was explicitly discouraged. Hitler had given orders that the offensive should proceed with a wave of terror and fright and no humane inhibitions. The Malmedy massacre occurred just one day before Wereth, December 17, 1944, when SS troops executed 84 American prisoners. The same unit, the 1st SS Panzer Division, was involved in both massacres. But Wereth was different. Malmedy was a mass execution, brutal but relatively quick. Wereth was torture, extended, deliberate, sadistic torture before execution. The racial element cannot be separated from what happened. Other American prisoners captured during the Bulge were treated as POWs, according to conventions of war. The Wereth 11 were tortured to death. When American forces retook the area in January 1945, a Belgian civilian led them to the field where the bodies lay. They were frozen in the snow, partially covered. The condition of the bodies shocked even hardened combat soldiers. Captain John Rubinstein, the investigating officer, documented the scene meticulously. His report describes in clinical detail the injuries each man sustained. He photographs the bodies, he interviews witnesses, he collects evidence, and then his report disappears into army archives for decades. January 1945. American forces have pushed the Germans back. The Battle of the Bulge is effectively over. Germany's last major offensive has failed, at enormous cost to both sides. As American units retake the areas that had been under German control, they begin discovering evidence of war crimes. The Malmedy massacre is widely reported. 84 American Blues executed by SS troops. It becomes one of the most publicized atrocities of the European War. But Wereth is documented, investigated, and then buried. Captain John Rubinstein's investigation report is thorough and damning. It identifies the perpetrators as elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division. It documents the torture. It names the victims. It includes photographs and witness testimony. The report is filed with Army Judge Advocate General's office, and then it sits for years. Why wasn't there prosecution? Why didn't the Wereth 11 become as well known as the Malmedy victims? The answer is complicated and disturbing. We're at the halfway point of this story, and it only gets more complicated from here. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the other 149 stories we're telling from the black perspective of World War II. Comment below where you're watching from. We love seeing how global this audience is. Let's build the biggest community telling these forgotten stories. First, numbers. Malmedy had 84 victims, a large-scale massacre that was easy to document and prosecute. Wereth had 11 victims, smaller scale, easier to overlook in the chaos of post-war justice proceedings. Second, race. The Malmedy victims were white soldiers. Their deaths received immediate attention from the press, from Congress, from military leadership. The Wereth victims were black soldiers. In 1945 America, their deaths simply didn't generate the same level of outrage or demand for justice. Third, the nature of the crime. Malmedy was a relatively straightforward war crime. Prisoners lined up and shot. Wereth involved torture, harder to prove in court, harder to present to the public, more disturbing to document. Fourth, the perpetrators. The SS officers responsible for Malmedy were prosecuted in the Dachau trials. Some were convicted and executed, but the specific SS troops who committed the Wereth murders, many likely died in the final months of the war. Others disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany. The unit was scattered, disbanded. Identifying individual perpetrators became difficult. But there's a fifth reason, and it's the one that explains why Wereth was forgotten for 50 years. The US military didn't want to talk about it. Prosecuting war crimes against black soldiers meant acknowledging that black soldiers had been tortured specifically because of their race. It meant admitting that Nazi racial ideology had murdered American soldiers. It meant having uncomfortable conversations about why American soldiers were segregated by race in the first place. In 1945, the US military was still segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, ate in separate mess halls, were buried in separate cemeteries. The Army's official position was that this segregation was necessary and functional. Highlighting the Wereth massacre would raise questions. If Nazi racism led to torture and murder of black soldiers, what did that say about American racism? If the SS saw black soldiers as subhuman, wasn't that uncomfortably close to how the US military treated black soldiers, as less capable, less trustworthy, less deserving? The military chose the path of least resistance. File the reports, document the evidence, and then forget about it. Don't publicize. Don't prosecute aggressively. Let it fade into the archives. And it worked. For 50 years. The families of the Wereth 11 received notification that their sons and brothers had died in combat. Some were told they died in the Battle of the Bulge. None were told about the torture. None were told about the war crimes investigation. The graves were eventually moved to American military cemeteries in Belgium. The headstones listed the cause of death as killed in action. No mention of massacre, no mention of torture, no mention of war crimes. Matthias Lange, the Belgian farmer whose farmhouse the soldiers had approached, knew the truth. He'd seen the SS arrive. He'd seen the soldiers taken away. He knew what had happened. For decades, he maintained a small memorial in the field where the bodies were found. But his story was local, Belgian, disconnected from American memory. The Wereth 11 became a footnote, if they appeared in histories at all. Most books about the Battle of the Bulge don't mention them. Most documentaries ignore them. They were erased from the narrative of America's good war. 50 years after the massacre, a Belgian schoolteacher and historian named Herman Lange, grandson of Matthias Lange, the farmer who had witnessed the soldiers' capture, begins researching the story. Herman had grown up hearing about the 11 American soldiers from his grandfather. The memorial in the field had been maintained by the Lange family for decades, but few outside the village knew what it represented. Herman decided the story needed to be told properly. He began digging through Belgian archives. He contacted American military historians. He found Captain Rubinstein's investigation report, filed away, gathering dust for 50 years. He identified the victims by name. He traced their families in America, and he discovered that most of the families had no idea what had really happened to their loved ones. The families had been told their sons died in combat. They'd received letters of condolence. They'd gotten death notifications. But nobody had told them about the torture, the war crimes investigation, or why justice had never been pursued. When Hermann Langer began contacting these families in the mid-1990s, the reactions ranged from shock to anger to renewed grief. They'd spent 50 years believing their loved ones had died honorably in combat, which they had, but they hadn't known about the brutality of their final hours. One family member said, "They didn't just take his life, they took his dignity, his humanity, and then they took his story. For 50 years we didn't know. Nobody knew." Hermann Langer, along with Belgian officials and American veterans organizations, began a campaign to properly memorialize the Wereth 11. In 1994, a small ceremony was held in Wereth, attended by Belgian officials, American veterans, and some family members who could make the journey. In 2004, 60 years after the massacre, a permanent memorial was finally erected in Wereth. It lists the names of all 11 soldiers. It describes what happened to them. It stands in the field where their bodies were found, maintained by the Belgian community. But the memorial in Belgium was only the beginning. In the United States, efforts began to ensure the Wereth 11s were recognized in American military history. Veterans organizations pushed for inclusion in textbooks and documentaries. Scholars began researching and writing about the massacre. In 2011, a documentary film about the Wereth 11 was released, bringing wider attention to the story. In 2013, the Wereth 11 were posthumously awarded the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, recognitions that should have come decades earlier. In 2019, a permanent memorial to the Wereth 11 was finally dedicated in the United States at Fort Benning, Georgia, now Fort Moore. Surviving family members attended. The Army formally acknowledged what had been done to these soldiers and how their story had been buried. But even now, the Wereth 11 remains relatively unknown. Ask most Americans about World War II atrocities, and they'll mention the Holocaust, maybe Malmedy. The Wereth 11, most people have never heard of them. Why does this matter? Why resurrect a painful story from 80 years ago? Because the Wereth 11 were murdered twice. First, physically, by SS troops in that frozen Belgian field. Second, historically, by a deliberate choice to forget them. The first murder was a war crime. The second was a choice to prioritize some stories over others, to deem some soldiers' deaths worth remembering and others worth forgetting. And that choice was based on race. The Wereth 11 were not the only black soldiers to face atrocities in World War II, but their story is uniquely disturbing because of what happened after they died. The massacre itself was a war crime. Brutal, motivated by racism, a violation of the laws of war. But the 50-year cover-up? That was an American choice. The US military documented the crime. They knew who the victims were. They knew who the perpetrators were. They had evidence, witnesses, forensic proof, and they chose to do nothing. They chose to file it away and forget. That choice tells us something important about how America dealt with race in the post-war period. The contradiction at the heart of World War II was glaring. America fought a war against Nazi racism and fascism while maintaining racial segregation at home. Black soldiers fought for a country that denied them basic civil rights. The Wereth 11 massacre highlighted this contradiction in the most brutal way possible. SS troops tortured and killed them because of Nazi racial ideology. And then America's military establishment buried their story, at least in part, because acknowledging it would raise uncomfortable questions about American racial ideology. It's 2025 now, 81 years since the massacre. The last World War II veterans are in their late 90s and early hundreds. Soon, there will be no living memory of the war, but the Wereth 11's story is still being recovered. Historians are still researching. Memorials are still being built. Families are still learning the truth. This is how historical erasure works, not through dramatic book burnings or explicit censorship, but through quiet choices to emphasize some stories and de-emphasize others, through filing reports that never get read, through monuments that never get built, through textbooks that mention some victims and ignore others. And it's how historical recovery works too, through researchers like Hermann Langer, who won't let stories die, through families who demand truth, through communities that build memorials, through documentaries and articles and videos that insist these soldiers' deaths mattered, their stories matter. The Wereth 11 deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as soldiers who served their country, even when their country didn't fully respect them. They served in a segregated military. They fought for a nation that denied them equal rights. And when they were captured, they were tortured and killed because of their race. And then they were forgotten, deliberately, systematically, for 50 years. Remembering them now is an act of justice. Incomplete justice, late justice, but justice nonetheless. On December 17, 1944, 11 black soldiers surrendered to German forces in Belgium. They expected to become prisoners of war. They were tortured and murdered instead. For 50 years, America forgot them, not by accident, not through oversight, but through a deliberate series of choices: to not prosecute aggressively, to not publicize, to not memorialize, to not include them in the narrative of the war. Those choices weren't made by Nazis. They were made by Americans. The men who murdered the Wereth 11 were motivated by Nazi racial ideology, a grotesque system of racial hierarchy that led to genocide and atrocity. But the Americans who buried the story for 50 years, they were motivated by a different kind of racial ideology, one that said some soldiers' stories matter more than others, that some deaths deserve attention and others don't, that the discomfort of confronting racism is more important than the duty to remember. Today we know their names: James Stewart, Thomas Fort, Major Bradley, George Davis, Curtis Parnell, Robert Turner, James Leatherwood, Nathaniel Moss, George Maddox, and Dew Turner. We know what happened to them. We know they were tortured. We know they died in agony. We know their bodies were found frozen in a Belgian field, mutilated beyond recognition. And we know that for 50 years, America chose to forget them. The Wereth 11 were forgotten for 50 years. We're not going to let them be forgotten again. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel. We've got 149 more stories from the black perspective of World War II that need to be told. Comment below with where you're watching from and share this video. The algorithm buries stories like this unless people engage. Don't let them be forgotten a second time. What do we owe the Wereth 11? We owe them remembrance, not just of their deaths, but of who they were. Soldiers who served despite segregation, who fought despite discrimination, who died horribly and were denied justice for decades. We owe them truth about what happened to them, about why it happened, and about why their story was buried. We owe them the honesty to acknowledge that America's relationship with its black soldiers in World War II was deeply contradictory, asking them to fight fascism while enforcing segregation, asking them to defend freedom while denying them equality, asking them to die for their country while treating them as second-class citizens. And we owe them the promise that we won't let this happen again, that we won't allow some soldiers' sacrifices to be remembered while others are forgotten, that we won't let race determine whose story gets told. The Wereth 11 can't speak for themselves anymore. They were silenced in 1944 by SS brutality and again by American institutional racism. But their story speaks anyway, about the cost of war, the persistence of racism, and the importance of refusing to forget. 11 men died in a frozen Belgian field on December 17, 1944. They died horribly. They were tortured because of their race, and then they were forgotten because of their race. It took 80 years, but we're finally remembering them properly. Their names, their service, their sacrifice, their story. Remember the Wereth 11.